At this point, I'd like to move on to Section 18, which I believe I've already commented is the most complicated part of the bill. This is the section that sets forth the provisions for the direct distribution of allowances at no cost to covered entities and opt-in entities that are engaged in emissions-intensive trade-exposed processes. The entities that can qualify to receive free allowances under this section, as of the operative date of the program, are actually specified in the legislation by the type of goods that they manufacture, as categorized using the North American Industry Classification System, or the NICS codes. The number of free allowances that a covered entity may receive under this section will be determined by a formula that is set forth in statute, but in response to Senator Bentz's comments, there are some pieces around this formula that are going to need to be further developed through rulemaking, although the formula itself is mostly set forth in statute. And in order to set forth that formula in statute, that resulted in some very complicated statutory language, and I thought it would actually be easier to explain how this provision works with an example rather than walking you through the statutory text. So we're going to pretend that I'm a covered entity that is an EITE entity and that I manufacture 3 goods at my facility in Oregon, and we're going to figure out what my direct distribution of allowances will be in a given year.
Maureen, just before you begin, we all, of course, want to be clear that we're talking about emissions of a certain size, right? That not all companies in these sectors are going to be EITE. They have to be regulated, which means they're emitting more than 25,000 tons a year or the equivalent.
Yes, Chair Stemmer Power. Yes, that is correct. This is referring to covered entities and opt-in entities that are regulated under the program and are EITE entities. Yeah. Although I will say that an opt-in, the definition of an opt-in entity is an entity that otherwise wouldn't be regulated under the program, but so they wouldn't have been designated as a covered entity, perhaps because they're an industrial facility that falls below that 25,000 emissions threshold, but they've voluntarily chosen to participate in the program. So that's what we're talking about here. They're participating. So we're going to figure out, for me, what my direct distribution of free allowances would be in a given year. Under the way that Section 18 is structured, the first thing that we would do is figure out what the benchmarks are for each of my 3 goods. So I manufactured blue widgets, green widgets, and sparkly pink widgets, right? Those are my 3 goods. The benchmark for each, I'm going to have a different benchmark for each of those 3 goods. Those benchmarks are going to be state specific, and their emissions per unit, and the benchmarks are based on an emissions per unit of output for my good manufactured in this state as of the operative date of the program. And that benchmark is calculated by the Carbon Policy Office. The method for establishing that benchmark is set forth in Section 18, subsection 5, and you'll note that there are 2 different methods for setting the benchmarks. There's one method for goods that are manufactured by only 1 or 2 covered entities in the state, covered or opt-in entities in the state, and there's another method for goods that are manufactured by 3 or more covered or opt-in entities in the state. The benchmarks are static over the life of the program, although under Section 18.8, sub 8 of the draft, the Carbon Policy Office will periodically report to the Joint Committee on Climate Action on whether those benchmarks should be adjusted. So now I have the benchmarks for my 3 goods. Next, for each one of my goods, the Carbon Policy Office is going to multiply my benchmark by my output of the good during the year prior to the year that the allowances are to be issued. The result of that calculation for each one of those goods is referred to as my annual good-specific emissions calculation. So I'll have one annual good-specific emissions calculation for my blue widgets, another one for my green widgets, and another one for my sparkly pink widgets. The office is then going to add those 3 annual good-specific emissions calculations up, and they're going to multiply that sum by a percentage that's adjusted annually as set forth in a schedule that's adopted by rule by the department. By the Carbon Policy Office. The bill provides details around how that schedule will be put together. It says that in year one, the percentage will, so in the year 2021, the percentage will be 100%. Starting in 2022, it will decline annually by a constant amount proportionate to the cap decline until the year 2050.
Sorry, Senator Rod.
Oh, thank you. Maureen, who's going to determine the starting point? Because where we start, so who's going to determine in industries at 85 tons? Or I'm just kind of lost at that.
So Chairs Denbrough and Power, Senator Girard, that's essentially what the benchmarking does. So the provisions in the bill addressing how the benchmark will be structured are the provisions that I'd encourage you to look at very closely around identifying that. And that's part of the piece where there may be some additional rulemaking. Let me jump to it real quick.
And colleagues, those of you who were on the committee during the interim will see some familiarity here, because what we've done is essentially incorporated the recommendations from the third-party Vivid people who did the analysis on EITEs. Yes, and so that's all incorporated in their report that they presented to us back in the fall. Yes, Senator Taylor.
I just want to understand on page 23, for the industries that are listed here, they're voluntary, they're opting in, right? You're saying, correct?
Chairs Denbrough and Power, Senator Taylor, some of them may be. The bill provides that one of the sectors that will be regulated under the program, we can generally refer to it as the industrial sectors. That's under Section 9, Sub 2A and B. Mm-hmm. So there'll be a regulated facility if they're a facility that is required to have a Title V or an ACDP air quality permit from the Department of Environmental Quality and has greenhouse gas emissions in an amount of 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent or more per year. So those industrial facilities are covered entities, and the NICS codes that you have listed here are NICS codes that identify which ones of those covered entities are identified in the bill as EITE. And I would encourage you to refer to the Carbon Policy Office and determine for information on exactly how many of the regulated entities under the provisions of this bill also show up as being listed as EITE here. So those are covered entities. This list include covered entities, and there may also be entities that are, they're entities that are required to have those air quality permits, but their greenhouse gas emissions fall below the 25,000 metric tons threshold, and they may choose to want to be regulated under the program for different business considerations, and they would register as an opt-in entity under the program. And if they register themselves as an opt-in entity under the program, they would also be eligible for these EITE if they are an industry that is manufacturing a good that's listed in these NICS codes that are set forth in statute.
So follow up?
Yes.
So thank you, Chair Denbrough. I'm trying to understand that obviously, over time, we want that number to go down. We want their emissions to reduce. And so if in 5 years that somebody who's above that threshold now, because their emissions is higher, and then now their greenhouse gas emissions, to be more specific, is higher, and we want it to decline. And then as they decline, do we have the flexibility to lower that bar so that, then what happens with the trading when those all eventually fall below, which is what we want them to do, we want their greenhouse gases to go down, then I don't quite understand, and maybe you have to have a model to show then what happens is with all the factors, the allowances, the trading, is that just going to have to be reevaluated every year by the Carbon Policy Office?
Chairs Denbrough and Power, Senator Taylor. So I think I'm understanding your question to be, if we say that an industrial facility is regulated because its emissions are above a certain threshold, then what happens when, by virtue of the program, by virtue of the requirements of the program, those same industrial facilities' emissions end up falling below the threshold?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is great.
So that is a very good question, and I think it would be a good question to refer to the Carbon Policy Office and the additional stakeholders and
Okay,
policymakers around, what the pros and cons are of the way the bill is drafted now, which is to say that you're a covered entity if your emissions are above that threshold. So the way it is drafted now, if your emissions fall below that threshold, you wouldn't be. If your emissions fall below the threshold, you wouldn't meet the requirements of Section 9 Sub 2. And so that may be something that warrants further discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And colleagues, we can go a little long, but
I'm sorry.
but we do want to finish this today. So, if this is something that needs immediate answer from Maureen, let's do it. And otherwise, we can get your answer to you. Bossart Davis.
Thank you, Chair Dembro. You just mentioned, as far as a question to Senator Taylor, that you said to direct those questions to the Carbon Policy Office. Did I hear that?
Well, actually, to Beth, and she will get them to the office and get a response to all of us.
That office hasn't been established yet, though.
Sorry. It's unfortunate that we're using that name as a placeholder. We do have the Governor's Carbon Policy Office.
Okay, I just thought maybe that meant ask those questions in the future, and I just wanted to make sure we could get those answers now.
Yeah.
Okay.
2021, we'll get you that answer. No. Yeah. And colleagues, let me say that the list of companies that we believe will be covered as regulated EITEs is on the website at the Carbon Policy Office. There are about 30 of them. Thanks, Maureen.
Yeah. So we've worked through my example of how the statutory language works for the allocation to EITEs. In addition to laying out how all that will work, so how that example, so the statutory language that drives that example I provided, Section 18 in subsection 6 also sets forth a process for how the EITE entities can apply for an adjustment to their annual allocation and provisions for exactly how that adjustment can be granted. And finally, Section 18 sub 7 requires the Director of the Carbon Policy Office to adopt by rule a process for determining whether the EITE allowances should be granted for free to entities that begin operation after the operative date of the program and that manufacture goods that are not represented in the NICS codes laid out in statute. So we have talked a lot about allowances, and part of the reason that the allowances are so important, of course, is that they're one type of compliance instrument under the program. But the other type of compliance instrument that a covered entity can use is called an offset credit, and offsets are provided for in Section 19 of the draft. So in general, an offset credit is generated by an offset project. The draft defines an offset project as a project that reduces or removes greenhouse gas emissions that are not regulated emissions. The offset provisions in the draft place a number of specific limitations on offset projects and provide that a total of no more than 8% of a covered entity's compliance obligation may be met by surrendering the offset credits. And furthermore, that a total of no more than 4% of a covered entity's compliance obligation may be met by surrendering offset credits that are sourced from offset projects that do not provide direct environmental benefits in this state. So that's where the direct environmental benefits definition comes up, Representative Marsh. There are references to the term impacted communities, both in the offset provisions of the draft and also in the investment provisions. And Section 20 of the draft directs the Carbon Policy Office to consult with certain other agencies and designated impacted communities using a methodology that takes into consideration certain criteria to identify, to specifically identify the impacted communities in the state. Moving on to section 21, we finally arrived at the provision for the state auctions. We've talked a lot about how the Carbon Policy Office distributes allowances for free. The other way that they can distribute allowances is by auction. And the important thing to highlight here is that these are state-run auctions of allowances. The proceeds from the sale at auction of these allowances are payable to the state. I do also want to mention that once an allowance is distributed by the state, either for free or through sale at the auction, allowances can be traded on a secondary market. And I want to note that here, it's a good time to note that the secondary market is the trade component of the cap and trade program. And the state does not receive any proceeds from entities buying and selling allowances on the secondary market, nor does the state receive proceeds from the generation and sale of offsets. The state only receives proceeds through these state-run auctions that are done pursuant to section 21 of the draft. And the proceeds received by the state through the sale of allowances at auction are required to be deposited in an auction proceeds distribution fund that's established under section 22 of the draft. So that distribution fund is essentially like a holding account. They have the auction, all the money goes into a holding account, and then from the holding account, the monies that constitute revenues described in Article 9, Section 3A of the Oregon Constitution are transferred to the Transportation Decarbonization Investments account. That's established in Section 32 of the bill. Monies that constitute revenues described in Article 8, Section 1G, 2(1)G of the Oregon Constitution are transferred to the Common School Fund, and the remaining money is transferred to the Climate Investments Fund established in Section 30 of the draft. Yes.